welcome in everyone to a very special interview with OutKick. We have Jeff Struecker with us, an Army veteran, a Black Hawk Down veteran, a chaplain. We're going to cover all those topics and much more. Jeff, I want to give you a huge shout out and a big thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's great to be with you.
First, right off the bat, like I just said, you're an Army veteran. So what motivated you to take that step to join the military?
My buddy in high school, he, without even talking to me about it, just went and signed up. And then he came back the next day, our senior year of high school, and said, "Hey, Jeff, I just joined up. You should join up too. It'll be cool," air quotes. What he didn't tell me until later is that the Army was giving him extra money if he could get his idiot friend from high school to sign up. So it was my buddy Tony in high school that kind of talked me into it.
And then just like that, you were off to the races. Now you end up in the Army Rangers, which is one of the most elite units in the world. Are they technically defined as a special forces unit?
Yeah, well, special operations is the official title, and that's the big umbrella of all of those clandestine special ops units out there across all branches of the military. But yes, the Army's Ranger Regiment is a special operations unit.
Perfect. And the training for that, walk the audience through that a little bit, because it's famously difficult. It's notoriously tough to get through. There's a high dropout rate, I believe. So is there anything that when you got there just really shocked you or surprised you?
Yeah, well, every special operations unit has a different process to get their people ready to serve in the unit. The Ranger Regiment is one of those few units in the military that's special operations, but they take guys and gals straight from basic training, which means that they have to basically do this in-depth assessment and selection process is what it's called. The idea is you go through some kind of basic training, get your job in the military. You will volunteer, because you have to volunteer to serve in this kind of unit. Volunteer to serve in the Ranger Regiment. If you make it through their assessment and selection process, which I'll describe in a sec, then they'll send you off through to do some airborne training. And then eventually you're going to be expected to attend the Army's Ranger course. And you really have to successfully complete that thing in order to stay in the unit.
And so, sorry, go ahead.
Well, that whole selection process, man, it tries you in every possible way. Yeah, the attrition rate is high. There are other units that have a much higher attrition rate. But for the Ranger Regiment, it's a long process over time before you're ready to lead in that unit. So they're going to dig deep into your finances. They're going to look deep into your family background. They're going to check you out psychologically. Obviously, there's a lot of really strenuous physical events that you have to be able to do. They're going to test you intellectually, physically, but they're also going to literally give you some academic tests to see if you have what it takes to be able to serve. And the whole time that you're doing this, they'll throw some scenarios at you. You'll do, basic maneuver kind of stuff. And they're just trying to determine whether or not you're going to quit when the unit needs you the most. That's essentially what it's trying to do.
And so in what year, sorry, I guess I should ask this right from the jump. What year did you join the Rangers? What year were you in?
I showed up in the Army in 1987. I went straight to the Ranger Regiment and stayed there for the first 10 years of my career, nonstop. Left, and then I came back to that unit and did the last basically 7 years of my career with them. And I absolutely loved it, man. It was the privilege of a lifetime to serve with those folks.
So in 87, that's the peacetime era, right? The Cold War is essentially winding down. The military is not being built up for some imminent conflict, but you have Panama, and you did go to Panama, correct?
Yeah, I'm glad you're pointing this out, David. So when I joined the Army, the language that everybody used is, if you ever go to combat, like maybe once in an entire career in the military, you'll go to war. By the time that the global war on terrorism started, 2001, the language was when you go to combat. So yeah, I'd been in the Army for a couple of years by the time that the Ranger Regiment kicked off the invasion of Panama in 1989.
And that was your first experience with combat then, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I had a guy next to me who was a pretty senior guy in the unit, and he had already been involved in the U.S. invasion of Grenada in 1983. And in my first firefight, he was kind of talking me through what it was like and what was going on and how to keep my wits about me. And he had a guy next to him that was in Vietnam who was walking him through his first firefight. And I tried to do that for Rangers the first time they went to combat too.
So you really have to lean on, I mean, that's not to sound cliche, but you're leaning on the guys next to you for their experience, the guys who've been there before.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
And so Panama obviously was not a long engagement, rather quickly. You come back, and then let's get into, you know, the infamous Somalia deployment for the American forces. When did you guys start to think, okay, we might be getting sent over to Africa?
Yeah, if I can make one quick interlude.
Yep.
In 1991, I got sent over to Kuwait with 1st Ranger Battalion and took part in Operation Desert Storm.
Oh.
So I'm in Panama in 89, Kuwait in 91, and in 93, just so you know, Rangers are always on the books. If the U.S. is going anywhere and doing anything, there's no question we want the Rangers involved. And because they're special operations and because they can respond in a moment's notice, my entire career with the Rangers was spent ready to deploy tomorrow, or actually ready to deploy in a few minutes notice if that's what it takes. So many times we got notified stuff was brewing somewhere around the world. Get your bags, pack them, get ready to start training. And then at the last second, it got turned off.
So
in the summer of 93, well, just to answer your question, in the summer of 93, my unit from Georgia and this huge special operations force from all over the U.S. military, we all went to Texas to do these big joint missions out in the desert in Texas. We've been out there for a couple of weeks. And while we were out there, my company got a call and said, hey, drop all of your stuff, stop training in Texas, get on airplanes and fly to the East Coast because we're going to send you guys off to Africa. And that's when we first found out that we were on our way to Somalia.
So I don't know if quickly would be the right word, but it all came together rather rapidly. Is that a fair assessment?
The Ranger Regiment is built to go anywhere in the world in a moment's notice. And so for us, it was like, okay, here we go. Maybe we end up over there. Maybe we don't, but we're just going to stop training for this and start training for that now.
So I know everyone, or a lot of people watching this interview, they've seen the movie. It's a great film. It's one of the best movies made in a long, long time. But the movie doesn't cover anything that happened pre-October 3rd. And obviously you guys were there for, it's not like you just showed up and October 3rd happened, right? So can you walk our audience through what was going on in the weeks, days, whatever it might have been before October 3rd? How many were you getting into contact regularly? Were things relatively calm? Could you sense this situation is going to boil over? What was it like on the ground before the major incident?
So the movie does the best to try to give you like the backstory, but there's no backstory. It's just 2 hours of just killing, but bad guys getting killed. And by the way, if anybody's wondering, the movie is very, very accurate. So in the summer, well, basically in the start of the 1990s, there was a drought in the Horn of Africa on the east coast of Africa. That drought left a lot of crops dead, which resulted in famine, which started to lead to starvation. That's basically how this thing progressed. By 1992, you had hundreds of thousands, and I mean several 100,000 people in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia that were already dead, literally just starved to death. Late 1992, the United Nations and the US said, hey man, we've got to do something. We can't just watch these people die. So, and if you've been around and some of your audience is a little bit older, you'll remember those Aid for Africa, huge international events that were going on, trying to send help over there because the continent itself was just devastated. December of 1992, United States Marines landed on the beaches of Somalia, and they started to push inland, and their job was to open up supply routes so that the United Nations can hand out food. And when I say food, I mean like a bag of beans, bag of rice, and just enough to keep you alive for one day. About a dozens of United Nations countries showed up, and most of the forces were devoted to Somalia. That's where the famine was the worst. But also, Somalia didn't have a government, no police force, no military. So it was basically the Wild Wild West. Anybody with a gun could do whatever they wanted to do. And in the spring and summer of 93, a couple of warring factions started to fight one another to become the most powerful dude in Somalia. And one or two of those warring factions started to target United Nations workers. Summer of 93, Mohammed Farah Aidid, who led the Haber Getter clan, started to ambush U.S. supply convoys. He started to attack food distribution sites. And in June of 93, he ambushed and murdered 24 United Nations workers from Pakistan. This caused the UN Security Council to meet together. And the Security Council said, hey, we got to do something about this guy. We can't let this event stand. So the United States responded with Task Force Ranger. That was my unit. Very, very small, very surgical package. So a company of Rangers, a helicopter unit from Kentucky, and special operators from all branches of service up and down the East Coast. We all went to Somalia. We're not there to hand out food. We're there to kill or to capture Aidid and take down the top leadership from his clan and kind of remove them from the equation. That's what caused us to go to Somalia.
So is that technically considered that's not then considered a peacekeeping mission, right? Because you're there for direct military action.
Great question, David. So all of the forces, U.S. and United Nations forces that were in Somalia before we showed up there were under United Nations operations in Somalia, Part 1. UNISOM is the acronym for it. When we showed up, this is definitely not peacekeeping, and we are not there to hand out food. We're going to kill or capture some people. So they have to do a second phase of the operation. We show up under phase 2, which is kill or capture. And it's just this very small surgical force that goes in there to kill or capture. Everybody else is still in the country to hand out food and to try to stop people from starving to death.
And how soon from when Task Force Ranger shows up on the ground in Somalia did you guys get into your first contact with either Aidid's men or other warring factions, like you said? Was it pretty much immediately?
Yeah. Hey, I just want to go on record and say I did not set David up to ask this question.
No, not at all.
I landed on the ground at about 6 o'clock at night, and at 8 o'clock at night, I got in my first firefight, my first combat. And it was nightly, and mortar attacks, direct fire on us from the moment that we got off of the airplanes, basically until we got back on. But the big fights only happened. There were only about 7 missions that we actually did in the city. Now, we received enemy fire literally every day. And guys were getting wounded around us regularly. But the big battle that becomes known as Black Hawk Down, that doesn't happen until 12 weeks into it.
Did you feel like in that first 11 weeks before that, did you guys and your teammates and everyone there for your part of the mission, part 2, the combat arm of it, did you feel like you were having success in what you were there to do, or did you feel like maybe you're struggling a little bit?
It was taking a lot longer than we all expected it to take. There was a lot of unanswered questions that the intelligence community just couldn't give us answers to. So you're going to have to figure this out when you get on the ground. We call it on-the-job training. Like, you get there, you figure it out. We thought it would take about 6 weeks to do everything we needed to do, kill or to capture everybody we needed. And we're now 12 weeks in, and we still don't have Aidid, the #1 guy, and we still don't have a couple of the top-ranked guys. Now, we've taken out most of his organization by this point. But it's a lot slower than we all thought it was going to be. And the situation is deteriorating. And every time we roll out, it's becoming more and more deadly. So, I mean, all of us knew the direction that we were headed, if that's what you're asking.
So when you say it's getting more deadly, because I think what you just said, you knew the direction was going. When it's getting deadly, are you guys getting increased contact every day? Is the casualty rate going up? How is it increasingly getting deadlier for this part of the mission?
we're having to do more dangerous missions to go get the guys as we move our way up through the organization, and they're a lot less visible, which means now we have to go into their front door. Now we have to go into the worst part of town. Now we have to go in at the time of day that we don't want to go in. I mean, we at the beginning, we can set all of the conditions and kind of do what we want when we want to do it. As this goes along, a lot of the things that we would prefer get pulled away from us. And now it's just like, okay, by the time we go launch the operation that becomes known as Black Hawk Down, we're going in broad daylight, which never happens. We're going in the very heart of town that they're controlled, which means as soon as you get in there, you're outgunned and surrounded. And we also know there's no backup. So once you're in there, you're in there. And all of us knew that. Like that was all part of the plan. We did everything we can to mitigate those circumstances. But once you're in there, you're in there. And the only way out is to fight your way out.
So let's now talk about October 3rd, which for the viewers at home is the day, October 3rd, 1993, that now is known around the country as Black Hawk Down. Where are you when the situation starts? What is your job that day? And walk us through how things started for you and the people you were with.
Yeah. So we were always ready to go on a moment's notice, day in and night, all day, all night, ready to go in a couple of moments' notice. If a bad guy pops up on somewhere in the city, we know we can get in there and get him out in a matter of a few minutes. It's the middle of the afternoon. It's a Sunday. And at this point, we haven't done any afternoon missions. It's not that we have taken a break in the afternoon. We just prefer to do missions at night because of our night vision capabilities. But two bad guys, not one, but two really high profile bad guys are now meeting in the same building at the same time. And the plans start just a few minutes before we decide to go prepare the operation and launch to go get them. So I get notified because one of my jobs is to lead the Humvees through the city streets. I've got a squad of men, about 10 guys that I'm responsible for, and we take a column of about 12 or so Humvees. A group of guys on the ground will go in by Humvee. Everybody else goes in by helicopter. And this is the normal way that we do business over there. One mission went in on ground only, on Humvees only, but most of the time, most guys are going in by helicopter, and then they're all coming out on the Humvees. So we get notified, hey, there's a high probability that we're going to launch to go get these guys. I run in to start to look at the location in the city because I have to be the guy who's navigating all of these Humvees from our base to the target building. And we get maybe 30, maybe 45 minutes notice to prepare for this thing. So I get my guys spun up, I get them with all of their kit on and ready to go. And finally, the boss makes the call. Yeah, we're going to launch the mission to go get these guys. The helicopters fly in, little birds land on the rooftops, and they start to assault the building from rooftops. Rangers fly in on Black Hawks and slide down ropes, and they provide security outside the building in the four corners. And my job was to lead a bunch of Humvees, basically be the first vehicle in a bunch of Humvees that will stop about a half a block away from the target building. We're going to wait for the call that we've got the bad guys, and then all of the bad guys and everybody who went in by helicopter will drive up that last half block, throw them on the Humvees, and get out of there as fast as we can. That's the plan, but it never goes according to plan. And when we roll in, when the helicopters are flying in and I'm driving to the target building, one of the Rangers missed the rope and he almost died in the city streets. And I get called immediately to take Todd Blackburn and drop him off at the base, get him medical attention, and then turn around and get right back out there.
So your mission is already pivoted right from the jump, essentially, from being in that half block position to evacuate or take the prisoners and whoever else needs to come. So now you're going to get Blackburn, which is depicted in the movie. He's played by Orlando Bloom, if I remember correctly. Right. So you get him. Now, has the mass firefight started yet, or is that already underway?
Yeah, I mean, we're under fire the whole time that I'm going to get Blackburn. I have to fight my way up to get him. We placed him on a stretcher. He's unconscious, just barely hanging on to life. And I'm fighting my way to get to him, let alone to get him on the vehicles, and then start to fight my way back to the base to drop him off. We have a surgeon that's assigned to our unit, and I'm trying to get Blackburn back to the surgeon. And in the process, I come through this gunfight, and no exaggeration, thousands of enemy fighters, and most of them within point blank range of my vehicles. The vehicles get shot to pieces. And in the process, Dominic Pilla, who's sitting right behind me on the Humvee, is shot in the forehead and killed instantly. And at this point, he's the only guy that has been killed in action from our forces, from all of our forces in Somalia. And not long after Pilla dies, then helicopters start getting shot down.
So let me ask you about that specifically, because in the movie it's depicted he's on the 50 cal, I believe, and a guy in the road kills him, and then the Delta Force guy hops up there and he says he's been killed. So he gets killed. You're driving that Humvee, correct?
Yeah, well, I'm not driving. There's actually a guy next to me, but the movie is doing the best to just try to make this scene understandable. So the guy that's on the top of the Humvee in a 50 cal is about to get shot in the back when Pilla notices the guy who's about to shoot him. Pilla's actually sitting in the back of the vehicle. And Pilla sees this bad guy at the same time that this guy sees him. And these two guys actually shoot and kill each other at the same moment. But Pilla falls into the lap of the guy next to him, just like in the movie. Massive head wound, and he's dead before his body even hits the floorboard. So I have to make the call on the radio that now I've got a guy who's killed in action, and I'm fighting tooth and nail just to get back to the base, just like you see in the movie.
And the reason I ask that is this when it start at this point, are you still relatively, I don't want to say calm, but have you really, is it set in yet that this situation is about to get really, really, really bad? Or at that point, did you feel like we still got control over all of what's happening?
Right. No, you ask a really good question. I pointed out Panama and Desert Storm because Somalia is not my first rodeo, man. I've been shot at. I know what a firefight is like. But when I got to that moment driving down that street with Pillow right behind me, that's the moment where I realized everybody's going to die in these Humvees. We're not going to make it back to the base. It's just math. Like, we've got the best training and the best equipment on the planet, but nothing is going to win this math equation. There's just too many bad guys and too few of us. So we're all going to die. And my focus as the guy in charge of this little convoy is don't make any mistakes, do the best you can to get your men out of here alive. And even after Pilla's dead, yeah, I'm at the point where I start to realize we're all going to die tonight. But I've got a job to do, and my job is to lead my men. So I work really hard on trying to remain calm, even though I'm freaking out on the inside.
And so you get back to the base. And at this point in time, has a helicopter been shot down yet? Or does that come when you're at the base?
When I arrive back at the base, now I'm fighting for my life. I don't have time to pay attention to the radio, even though my boss is screaming at me trying to get a status update on Pilla.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, because this is a long time ago. Not everyone has individual radios. You're talking about the radio in the Humvee. Can you even hear the radio? Can you even hear it
inside the Humvee? And I'm the guy with the handset, but everybody in the Humvee can hear what's going on over that speaker box. And my boss is screaming to find out what's going on with Pilla. And just to shut him up, just like the movie shows, I yell, "Hey, Pilla's dead," and I'm busy, and throw the handset down. And when I get back to the base, that's when my boss comes up to me and says, "Hey, Jeff, we've had 2 Black Hawks go down. We had a small search and rescue force that we were keeping in reserve in the event that 1 Black Hawk went down. So we put them in at the first crash site. Now we're strapped. And now a 2nd Black Hawk has gone down. I didn't even know the first one went down." And my boss says, "Jeff, I need you to get back on the Humvees, and I need you to drive out there and see if anyone's alive where Mike Durant's helicopter crashed." And that's when I start to come to grips with, okay, this is a suicide mission. We're all going to die.
It's hard for me to even know how to respond to that. That's an unbelievable thing to be told, not just what you've been told, but that multiple helicopters are down. So at this point, you've just been given the orders. We're going back in. We're going to find this helicopter, Mike Durant, who, for those of you who don't know, obviously lives. I think he actually just ran for Senate in Alabama. I think he was a candidate anyways. So what's the plan now? Is it let's get as much ammunition and supplies as we can? I mean, what are you thinking?
Yeah, so my vehicles are shot to pieces. Dominic Pilla's dead body just got pulled out of the back, and it's covered in blood. And there's this poignant scene in the movie Black Hawk Down where one of the special operators comes up to me and he's like, "Hey, if you're going back out there tonight, man, don't leave your men sitting in all of that blood. Like, that will really mess them up psychologically." So I pulled this one Humvee off to the side and I started to clean the blood off the back, getting ready to go out in the city streets. Now the vehicle's already shot to pieces and it's covered in blood, and I am terrified at the back of that Humvee. And at that moment, I just simply totally relied on my faith. And I don't want to sound trite with this. Like, this is the moment where I just resign myself to, okay, tonight's the night. There's no way humanly possible that I'm going to survive. But because of my rock solid faith, because of my Christian beliefs of what happens in eternity, I guess tonight is the night that I step forward into heaven and meet God face to face. And I'm ready. So get back on those vehicles, go out there and do my job, ready for my death, basically, is how that went. And my faith gave me, I don't use this language lightly, but my faith gave me this sense of peace that really can't be explained any other way. Like, I was 100% sure I'm going to die. It's going to happen in the next few moments, but I'm not worried because I know what happens after I die. And that carried me through the rest of the night.
That's unbelievable. I hate to say the word unbelievable so much, but and we're going to get into your faith here for the viewers in momentarily. But on that point about how you kind of accepted it and you let God kind of take the steering wheel, did you feel like that gave you a sense of peace? Like, I can do my job better, even though I know what's inevitable, because I'm okay with how this is going to end. Is that kind of...
You nailed it. I've been telling warriors for 20 years after that. My faith gave me this sense of peace, and it actually made me able to focus on the enemy and on my men so that I didn't have to worry about myself. Like, I've resigned myself to what happens to me next. Now I can focus on my men and keeping them alive. Now I can focus on defeating the enemy and not making mistakes tonight, because I've taken myself out of the equation. And it was so noticeable that my buddies started asking questions about it the next day. Now, I just want to say to your audience real quick, like, if it sounds insane to send Struecker's Humvees back out into city streets after they've just gone through this crazy firefight, you'd need to understand the way that Rangers communicate, with the way that the Rangers have sworn, they swear their lives to one another, and they literally do it almost every day. They pledge their life to one another in what's called the Ranger Creed. And the Ranger Creed is my way of pledging to my buddy, I will never let you fall into the hands of the enemy. And if your body falls there, I will go get it out. And you swear to me that you'll do the same. So when my boss said, go back out there to the crash site, I don't even know if anybody's alive, but I do know I have made a pledge to these guys, and I'm going back out there and I'm bringing their bodies back to their family, even if it cost me my life tonight. And I know my buddies would have done the same for me. So there wasn't a question of going back out. It was just a question of, where am I going to find the strength or the courage to do it?
And so you obviously do. That scene is depicted in the movie as well. Take us through from when you leave the base to what happens. Now you're round two. Let's call it round two for simplicity. Yeah. You're back out there. Do you fight your way to the crash site? Yeah. Like, so it's just nonstop firefights, one after another.
This is the point where I really want to highlight all of the Rangers that are trained shooters are already in the city streets and they're already fighting for their lives. There's a handful of supporters that came over with us. They're part of our unit and they all get the same training, but their primary job are cooks and supply clerks and intel specialists. And when we get notified, hey, you got to go back out there and you got to get to the Durant crash site, it was pretty obvious. We don't have enough guns. So I need more guns. And I just asked all of the supporters, hey, if you've got a gun, would you be willing to jump on the Humvees with me? And every single one of them said, sure, I'll grab my gun. And I'm talking cooks and the ammunition guy. And I call him the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, but they all grabbed their guns and they all jumped on the vehicles and they all rode back out into the city streets with me. And every one of them knew I may die doing this. But none of them hesitated, not one of them. And they stayed on those vehicles with me all night long, till 9 o'clock the next morning, fighting back and forth. It never let up until I arrived back at the base. The bullets didn't stop flying. But yeah, we fought our way to the Durant crash site. I had a helicopter that was in the air and it was giving me some directions over the radio. But I got into such an intense gunfight that I told the helicopter, man, if I keep driving people through this, I'm going to kill more than we're going to rescue. We need to find another route. And as I was driving around the city to come into the crash site from the back side of the city, I linked up with a bunch of Rangers from my unit that were on vehicles that were totally destroyed, like the dead bodies just hanging off the sides. So we stopped what we were doing and drove those guys back to the base. I came back a second time. And that's when I thought, basically, we had everybody rounded up, but I learned, no, we're split up all over the city and we can't keep sending these Humvees in there because they're not armored. It's just fiberglass. So we need armored vehicles. And we asked the United Nations at about midnight, would you loan us your armored vehicles? So the Pakistanis showed up with 2 of their tanks. And the country of Malaysia had just arrived and they had a bunch of armored personnel carriers and they all met us. And together we rolled out into the city streets. I stayed on the Humvees, but we rolled out there at about midnight and stayed out there until 9 o'clock the next morning.
I just want to say real quick for you and the audience and everyone, what you just said about the cooks and the intel guys and everyone else grabbing guns, that makes me insanely proud to be an American. I think that if that doesn't sum up the spirit of what the USA can be all about, that is, I got chills right now. That's something else.
I can one up that one for you, David. That night, the Malaysians get into a big firefight and a couple of their men get killed right next to us on the city streets. And the commander of those forces pulled me off to the side the next morning. And he said, Jeff, this is the first firefight our country's been in since World War II. And this is the first time we've lost soldiers in combat since 1944. And we would not do this for any other country on earth but America. And we're proud to fight and to die right next to you. And I can't say enough about those Malaysians, man. They just stayed with us all night long.
It really puts things into perspective. I mean, it's the problems people think they have that might be really big in the grand scheme. When you hear stuff like that, you realize it can get way, way worse. So is it at 9 o'clock in the morning when you guys pull out and you get back to the base? Is that the first time that you felt we're now we've put a cap on it, it's over, it's done? Or was there a point as you're going back, maybe when the armor shows up, where you're like, okay, we've turned the tide, we're now regaining the power curve here?
Yeah, I don't know that any of us actually felt like we turned the tide, just because you're talking thousands or tens of thousands of armed Somalis, and we're a couple of hundred people in the streets. So there's no turning the tide. Maybe you made it out of there by the skin of your teeth. But when we finally make it, actually, we drive from the target building to a soccer stadium that was under the control of the Pakistanis. It was in United Nations control. We drive to the soccer stadium, and that's when we get the full assessment of how many are dead, how many are wounded, and how many are missing. And there's a lot missing. There's a lot. Basically, half of us were killed or wounded during those 18 hours. And we make our way back to the base, back to our base at the airfield. And it's when we get back to the base that we realize, like, all of the vehicles are shot. 5 of the 6 Black Hawks that were carrying people were shot out of the skies. 2 of them crashed in the city streets. The others were able to make emergency landings, but we got everything that we owned was shot to pieces that night. And it wasn't until 9 o'clock the next morning that we were able to survey the damage and just realize how bad this was. But again, when you do the math, you're going to get those kind of results every time.
Let me ask you this, because this, I think, is something that I don't really understand, and I'm sure the viewer doesn't understand. You know, we're used to watching war movies where it's like the Germans in the German uniforms, they're fighting the Americans, and it's very clear, bad guys over here, good guys over here. But now you're in an urban city and the bad guys aren't wearing uniforms. How are you able to tell who's a good guy and who's just, or I guess who's an innocent person out on the streets and who's a fighter trying to kill Americans?
You ask a really good question. We go into the city looking for these two guys, and we get these two guys and everybody that's around them, and we're bringing them back, and we're doing our best. Just so you know, Rangers protected those bad guys with their own lives because we needed the intelligence from them. But we're in the city streets, and not only are we surrounded by guys with guns, but they're also using children and they're using women as human shields while we're out there. And it gets really complex really fast. And the truth is that every warrior has a decision, and those decisions are usually split second, and whoever's first on the trigger lives and whoever's last on the trigger dies. But I conducted myself on the battlefield like, not only is it my responsibility to fight with honor and to keep my men alive, but I'm also going to have to stand before a God in heaven for what I do. And so I'm only going to do the right thing that I will be proud of, my country will be proud of, and I won't have to, wonder what God is going to think about me one day when I stand before him. And that was the thing that guided my ethics on the battlefield.
That's a great answer. I just have a couple more things on Black Hawk Down, and then I really want to dive into your religion.
Sure.
When you look back, because I know it's become a controversial thing, and I don't want to get it political, but one of the big criticisms has been, why did the guys out there not have heavy armor? Why wasn't there more assets given to them? This maybe could have been avoided if they had more assets. Do you agree with that? Like, do you feel there's something that could have changed the calculus before it even started that you didn't have, or do you think no matter what had happened, the outcome would have been what the outcome was?
There's no question. We went to Somalia under some very restricted rules of engagement. No close air support, no jets with bombs, no armor, no collateral damaging producing munitions. I mean, you name it. All of the things that America goes to war with, you guys are not going to war with. You and your buddy and your gun. And certainly the firefight would have turned out differently. I'm not sure how many more would have lived, or how many more. I'm not sure how many more Americans would have lived. I know a whole lot more Somalis would have died if we had all of the things that are normally at our disposal. But the next morning, when we make it back to the base, it's pretty clear to us, the whole crew from Mike Durant's crash site and those two snipers that went in to try to rescue them are all missing. And we watch on CNN like everybody else in the world is watching live as their bodies are being desecrated in the city streets. And all of us just start throwing our equipment on and getting ready to go back out there and to get our buddies out of there. And we get immediately told from the Clinton administration, no, you're not going back out, and no, you're not going to do any more operations. In fact, we're rethinking the whole thing because of this big firefight. And the answers, we repeatedly asked the government to allow us to bring more equipment, specifically armored vehicles over there. And the answers kept coming back no, every time our boss asked. So as a result, the Senate called for the impeachment of the president and the resignation of the Secretary of Defense. And eventually the Secretary of Defense resigned over this, and should have.
That's what I was just going to ask, if you thought that the Secretary of Defense deserved to, I don't want to say fall on the sword, but
Les Aspin took the bullet for this one as the Secretary of Defense, and he did it to save the presidency, and he should have. Because when a guy on the ground, when your general on the ground is saying, hey, I need these vehicles, and you keep telling him no, you pretty much have determined how this thing is going to turn out when the bullets start flying.
Did they ever get the bodies of the guys that were missing back, or were they lost forever?
the U.S. sent a special envoy over immediately to Somalia. By the way, fun fact, as soon as this firefight is over with, then the Navy carriers start showing up. Then the jets start rolling across the city streets. Then the U.S. shows up with the full military might. But special envoy to Somalia, Robert Oakley, shows up and he starts to negotiate through intermediaries. And he basically says, we want our bodies back and we want all of them back, or else we're just going to destroy everything. And the 5 of the 6 bodies that were missing eventually show back up pretty quickly. And we learn that Mike Durant is still alive and a prisoner of war for almost 2 weeks before Oakley is able to negotiate his release. And then Clinton says, pack your stuff up and get out of there. We're done. Which was the ultimate slap in the face.
When it happened, were you extremely upset, or was the anger beyond words? Because you call it a slap in the face. I mean, what were your emotions like when he told you guys to go home?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought was, okay, if this thing is worth fighting, then it's worth winning. And whatever it cost us, even my life, I will do it to win this war. But President, you decide whether or not it's worth winning. And if you tell me it's not worth winning, then I got to ask, why the heck are we fighting it in the first place? Because if it's not worth doing what it takes to win, then let's don't even fight it in the first place. And I really think this is, look, I'm not a politician, don't want to be one. But the political fallout in the international community for the way that we left Somalia, it ultimately led to the conditions where a guy like Osama bin Laden would believe, well, if you hit America strong enough in the nose and their nose starts bleeding, then they're going to run away with their tail between their legs. And it was that foreign policy decision that I think led the dominoes to September 11, 2001.
That's fascinating when you watch that play out over time. I never thought about that before. This is the last question I'll ask about Black Hawk Down, and I kind of want to end on a patriotic or on a high note for the viewers, because this is the United States of America. We are absolutely the good guys. When you look back at that day, if you could just say one memory, what are you most proud of, or who are you maybe most proud of for in all the horror of October 3rd into the following day? What's one memory where you're like, I could not be prouder of this?
The thing that I will carry to my grave are the men that I was serving with. All of them around me, every single one of them were willing to fight to their death for this mission. And the guy that was on the 50 caliber in front of me, on top of my Humvee, he took a round across the eye. He took shrapnel, burning hot shrapnel in his hands. And all night long, I tried to get this private that's been in the Army for less than a year and a half off of the 50 cal and get him to get into the Humvee and let me put somebody else on the gun. But no matter what I did, Brad Paulson refused to give up his gun. And he basically said, no, Sergeant, it's my job. It's my gun. I'll stay up here until my death if I have to. And I will go to my grave thinking, God, what a privilege to be able to work with guys like this. Like, what an honor.
That is amazing. That is, I mean, like I said, it makes you really proud to be an American when you hear stuff like that. It reminds you just how great many people here are. I want to pivot now into religion, which I know is incredibly important to you, and you touched on it. You went and became a chaplain and then commissioned and returned to the 75th Rangers, correct?
Yeah.
So what motivated that decision?
Great question. It all happened in an instant and after the firefight was over in Somalia. So I'm back. We're trying to see who's dead, who's missing, who's wounded. Vehicles, helicopters are shot to pieces. And now my buddies who know about my faith, because I've been open about it, they start walking up to me and they're asking me some really hard questions. Like, Jeff, where's my buddy who just got killed? Like, what happens to a person after they die? And Jeff, if I roll back out in the city streets tomorrow night, what happens to me? And Jeff, I watched you last night. And there was something different about you, because when everybody else was freaking out, you were calm. So obviously there's something that you have, and we have the same training and the same equipment. So whatever it is, I don't know what it is, but I know I want it. And I realized the next day, like, I was able to do on the battlefield what I did because of my faith. And these guys didn't have it, but now they're asking some really, really hard questions about faith. And that's the moment where I just felt this overwhelming sense. Like, I don't even know where this came from, because I never considered it for a second before this. But that's the moment where I just realized, like, these guys need they need a shepherd. They need a guide. And I'm going to go to school, become a minister. I want to lead them, and I want to be able to help them when they struggle with their faith, which is eventually what caused me to end up coming back in as an Army chaplain and serving with the same unit many, many times in Afghanistan and Iraq.
It's such an incredible arc. I have a question for you, and I actually asked this question to my youth leader when I was a very little kid, like 6 or 7 years old, and I think it's relevant, and I think you could give an interesting thing. As a kid, I struggled. I loved the military forever. I still do. I'm 30 years old now, but I was raised in a religious family, a Christian family, and I didn't understand how you could square being a Christian with, we might have to kill people. And so what do you tell people, or like, how can you claim to be, Christian, but you're more than okay with killing people? I mean, I think I understand. I can square it just fine now. I grew up a little bit, but what would you say to someone who might not get that?
David, this is the number one most often asked question that I get, and probably 3,000 times somebody has asked me that question. There's a long and a really the adequate answer is going to take longer than this broadcast, but I will say the short answer. One, for me, there was never a struggle between being an Army Ranger, killing bad guys on the battlefield, and being a Christian. I never struggled with that. Second, I see a distinction in the Bible. It's very, very obvious between murder and killing. And what happens on a battlefield is killing, and even killing that may be sanctioned by the government, which is instituted by God. I'm not saying that God sent me to Somalia to kill bad guys. I'm saying that God established the United States government, and the U.S. government sent me there. And I view myself, by extension, as a part of the U.S.'s military force that keeps peace around the world. Keeping peace sometimes means killing the guys that would destroy peace for others. And for me, I don't struggle with that. But as an Army chaplain, part of my responsibilities were to interview the guys and gals that said, I don't think I can do this because of my faith. They were conscientious objectors. And I just want to say, I have a very soft spot in my heart for people who don't agree with me. I totally understand where they're coming from. I completely support their point of view. I just look at it differently, and I'm not where they are. So to this day, I've never struggled, and I just want to say this, never lost a night of sleep over all of the killing that I've done or seen on the battlefield. I've never struggled with that, but I do recognize that a lot of people do. And for me, it's just because of my theology and the way that I interpret the Bible. There's a lot more, like an hour's worth of answer that deserves to be said here, but that's where I am on it.
That will more than suffice for the time being. And I can't remember the exact, but when I was a kid, they pulled out the Bible and they read some verses, which I should be ashamed. I don't remember what they were, 23 years later, but no, and that's good to hear. And I wanted to ask you that. I had that right away at the top of the list of questions. When you
can I just say this for your listeners? I'm sorry to interrupt you, David. If you're struggling with this and you're like, okay, Jeff, I don't get where you're coming from, then go to the Old Testament, go look at the book of Deuteronomy, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua, and go read the passages about what's called the cities of refuge, because you will see God is making a very clear distinction between murder and killing, and he commands Israel to protect those who killed, but to hand over those that murdered, and even set special cities aside where they will be protected, because God views this as two very different things.
Perfect. Well, there you go for the viewers. Perfect. So now in your chaplain role, and it kind of plays back to what you just said about the guys in Black Hawk Down the next day, was it common for people to go on deployment experienced traumatic experiences. Maybe they were an atheist, or they just didn't care. Maybe they weren't openly atheist. Maybe it just wasn't part of their life religion. And then after watching people die, maybe killing themselves, going through trauma, they came to you and they were completely changed on the religious aspect. And now they did want to find God.
Yeah, because just to put all the cards on the table, when I was a chaplain, almost everybody recognized my name from Black Hawk Down. So I wasn't just a chaplain, I was the chaplain that was in Black Hawk Down, which caused a lot of people to come talk to me after they went to combat and saw some crazy stuff. And they were like, hey, I need your advice, Jeff, because you're a chaplain and you were in Black Hawk Down as an enlisted guy. And lots of warriors asked me questions, trusted me with questions that they probably wouldn't ask another human being. It always impacts somebody. And I would say there's something psychologically wrong with you if you can go to war and you can see a lot of killing or do a lot of killing and come back totally the same, like no, not at all impacted by that. They're like, that's not natural. That's not good. So I tried to walk my friends that were coming, or the warriors that were coming to me, I tried to walk them through what they were struggling with. And I tried to help them as much as I could, but I tried to treat every person individually, because what one guy or gal goes through on the battlefield, even if you're right next to them, is not what you go through. So I just tried to deal with it case by case and person by person. But I do want to say to your listeners, man, I went 9 times to Afghanistan and 5 times to Iraq as a chaplain. And I saw a lot of that firsthand. And I just happened to be the guy right there next to them so that when they were struggling, they could reach out to me because I'm right there and they know my background.
And was it difficult for you to go from a combat intensive role where you're on the battlefield, shooting people, getting shot at, watching your friends die, to now where you're in a chaplain role where you're kind of advising, you're not getting shot at, but you're mentoring, maybe would be the best word. You're preaching to people who definitely are getting shot at. Like, what is that transition to go from high intensity to then off the battlefield?
That was rough. There was a really rough, it was a pretty short, but a really rough period where I had to radically rethink my role on the battlefield. And up to this point, I know exactly what to do with a gun and a bad guy in front of me. Now I don't have a gun and there are bad guys in front of me, and I had to figure out what is my job on the battlefield. And I really needed help. I needed a couple of very experienced guys, and I needed God's help to remind me, Jeff, your job is not to focus on the enemy anymore. Now your job is to focus on America's warriors and to be there with them, but not thinking about the enemy, which is a hard thing to do when you're getting shot at. You need to think about America's warriors and focus on them instead of on the bad guys. And it was a really rough transition, but with a lot of help, it was a really short transition. Now I can focus on America's warriors instead of on the enemy.
Was there ever a time where you were on a base somewhere and you know, something happened and you kind of had an urge or a sense for like, man, I wish I was out there right now getting it on with these guys?
I went, I'm not at all ashamed to say this. I went on target with my men many more times than I stayed back on the base when they went out on target. They asked me to go out there with them on target and to be next to them. Now, I'm not the first guy in the door anymore, but I'm close enough to them that when the target is getting taken down, I'm out there with them. And they asked me to be there with them so that I can kind of be there immediately to give them some support, encouragement, to, you know, to help them out. And yeah, there were more than one time where it started to get pretty intense around us, and I had to try to get things under control and just to keep a sense of calm. Like, I tried to be the guy who was calm while everybody else was freaking out.
And you want a guy like that in all situations, business, sports, the military. As a Christian, when you look at society in 2022, what's something that really concerns you and what's something that gives you optimism?
Yeah. I'll tell you, both of these are really easy to answer, man. I'm very concerned with how complacent our society has become. I think this is kind of natural for any country that goes through the progress that we have of becoming a consumer society where we buy what we want and we get as much as we want anytime that we want. And we don't ever hear no as a society. And it causes me, I think in terms of strategy and national defense. And I think to myself, do we have a society that's tough enough to fight another World War II? Like if it took all that we had and people had to sacrifice at home and you had to plant a victory garden and you had to ration your butter and your petroleum, are we beyond the stage as a country where we would be willing to do that again? And that I don't know anybody on the planet has the answer to, but that is a very big concern of mine. America has become flabby as a society, and you need a fit society to win the big one. But the second question is pretty easy to answer too, man. I have great, great hope for the military. Every year I look at guys and gals that are coming into the military and I'm just blown away by them. And I'm like, man, I expected, because of the way that the rest of the society is gone, I expected guys and gals that are weak and passive and timid. And what I see is another generation after another generation that is ready for whatever America asks of them. David, one of my big concerns is America's military and America's greater population is becoming wider and wider apart from one another. Man, that's not a good thing, not good for the future of our country, because our military is so disciplined and so focused and so good. And our society, broader society, is so flabby. Man, it's got me really, really concerned about 12 or 25 years from now.
And I think that's a very fair point. I don't quote me exactly on the statistic, but isn't it something like almost half of American young men are considered too out of shape to even be drafted in the event a draft was? That's not good.
If you look at the fitness level of the average American citizen, most of them could not serve in the military because we're that out of shape and overweight. Like, I think the very same thing, like, just look at the average park in your city. Just look at the people walking across the park and wonder if we had to get them ready to go to war, could they even get ready? Yeah, I mean, it's a great concern. And when I say flabby, I don't mean terms of body fat, man.
No, I know you don't. I know you don't.
I'm talking about the comfort and convenience way that we live our life. Like, that's got me concerned.
I will say this just to add a little color to what you're saying. So I live in Washington, D.C. now, but I've lived all over the country, Wisconsin, Montana. I felt comfortable when I was living in Montana that the people around me, if things got really hairy, we'd be just fine. I do not feel that way about the average person living in Washington, D.C. at all. I think if their Starbucks went offline for an afternoon, it'd be meltdown mode over here. And that's sad to say.
That guy or that gal in Montana needs to figure out how to fight off a mountain lion and how to handle a bear if they're in their territory, but not in DC.
No. So this is a question I like to ask veterans. It's another opportunity to kind of shine a light on America, but also on the flip side of kind of and how some people are ungrateful. I think with young people my age and younger, they take a lot of things for granted, number one. And two, because to your previous point, life has been so easy, they don't seem to understand that things happened before them, but their lives were very difficult. And a lot of people paid a high price to be here. You're one of them. You know a lot of people who are one of them, and so on and so on. So when you hear young people trash America as a terrible country or a horrific place to live, what instinctually do you want to respond when you hear someone just acting like this is a terrible place?
I have to keep my instincts in check. Quick story, true story. Right after getting back from Somalia, we were invited by the future mayor of New York, D.C., just a handful of us, to go to New York City and to lead the Veterans Day parade in November. By the way, the future mayor of New York City was Rudy Giuliani. And Giuliani invited me and about 5 of the Rangers to show up and to start the Veterans Day parade and to walk it down Fifth Avenue. And while we were in uniform and getting ready to stage at the start of the Veterans Day Parade, no exaggeration, we were accosted in the subway by people who were screaming at us and spitting on us and calling us baby killers. And all of this is because of what they saw in the news about Somalia. And my buddy next to me went berserk and almost killed somebody in the subway. And I had to grab him and remind him, he doesn't know, the guy that's assaulting you right now doesn't know what you've gone through and will never understand what you've gone through. Now, to my buddy, Tim Pringle, that didn't make it any better because he's being spit on and accosted in the subway in New York. But I also reminded him he doesn't have to know, and he will never understand because he lives in a country where you have done for him what he didn't have to do for himself. And it doesn't make it any easier to deal with, but just remind yourself tonight, Tim, he doesn't know, he will never understand because you have done for him what he didn't have to do for himself. And when people make disparaging comments about America, when Americans make disparaging comments about America, I simply think to myself, you're just putting your ignorance on display. You don't know what you don't know, and you're broadcasting to the world what you don't know because you have never had to be in the shoes or the boots of the guys and gals that I served with. And if you did, you would never make these comments. Because let's just be honest, America is not perfect, not even close. But I've been all over the world, and there is not another nation on earth, not even close to the freedoms that you have in America. So complain all you want, but you can't go anywhere else and find better. Not even close.
That is a great answer. It's an answer that I like to hear. The reason I asked that is I went to college kind of when the Iraq War was not in a great place, I think is what would be a way to say. It wasn't as bad as 06, 07. And I was a poli-sci guy, so I had classes with young people, and they talk about like American soldiers were over there like slaughtering kids or just stuff like that. I'm like, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. And not only that, you're saying those things from the air-conditioned campus of the University of Wisconsin. You're never going to get on a plane and fly over there, but you'll critique, you'll judge people you don't know. And that always drove me up the wall. And I feel like, unfortunately, that anti-American mindset seems to be getting more and more common. It's not a rarity. Now it's like normalized in the mainstream. It's really unfortunate, but anyways.
You go to another country and see the way that people live and come back to the United States and then come talk to me about it, especially when you go deep into the heart of the country and see that the way people live in the rest of the world.
Right. So I have a current events question. Our readers always love current events. So obviously, China, Taiwan, the United States, tensions are getting really, really high. And I'm curious if you're paying attention to that, and if so, what is your opinion on whether America should be all in on defending Taiwan and in pushing back against China, or if you have a different view of how we should handle China?
Yeah, you ask a great question. And just so you know, I'm a guy who has been to China many times and have lots and lots of good friends in China that are Chinese citizens. And so I think I understand it from within China as well as from the U.S. strategic perspective. Look, America is the spokesman for freedom around the world. We're not the only, but we must be the primary spokesman for freedom around the world. So if Taiwan is saying, I want to be free, and China is saying, we're not going to allow you to be free, then America has a responsibility to stand up and to speak on behalf of the Taiwanese. Where that responsibility goes and how far that responsibility lasts, the national defense experts will argue about that until they're blue in the face. But I will say this. I know China from within, as well as I can see from a U.S. warrior's perspective, China's threat and their growing influence around the world. And China is very much becoming a world superpower. Just like when I joined the Army, it was Russia, well, it was the Soviet Union versus America. And the next big one is going to be America fighting the Russia or the Soviet Union. Well, China is moving in that direction, and the U.S. has to be very, very careful because if you're heading towards a second Cold War, the only reason the last Cold War didn't become a full-on war is we were really careful with diplomacy. So I think here's a long answer to a short question: tread very, very lightly with Taiwan. Walk on this one like you're walking on thin ice, because I'm not saying we shouldn't be all in for Taiwan. I'm just saying we need to be really, really careful about how we handle this, because China is definitely a near peer and on their way to becoming a superpower.
That's a good answer. I think that's an answer people will be able to sink their teeth into. So I got two regular questions left, and then I always end on a very, very fun one. We take one from the fans. So what's the biggest misconception in your mind about what's the biggest misconception civilians have about war that's not even close to what the reality is?
Yeah. Virtually everything that a civilian has in their mind about war is not close to reality. In fact, everything that I, as a warrior trained by some of the most experienced warriors in the military, had about war wasn't the case until I got there and saw it firsthand. And it's almost impossible to help somebody understand what war is really like. There's a book by an author by the last name of Marlantis that describes what it's like to go to war. And that's probably as accurate as anything that I've seen. But even that, words on a page just can't do justice to it. So war is moments of intense fear and minutes or months of total boredom. And really, you have these two extremes and not a whole lot in the middle. So that's war in a nutshell. And it's almost impossible to describe to somebody who's not been there.
That's fair enough. I believe that's a good answer. So this is one I've interviewed a lot of Delta Force guys. Since I was a little kid, I've been obsessed with Delta Force. In the movie Black Hawk Down, it looks like the captain, the Ranger captain, there's a couple scenes where he argues with the Delta Force guys. And was the relationship in real life that testy between the two groups, or did you guys get along way better than maybe it was depicted?
Yeah, that relationship between him and that unit really was cantankerous, a lot more than it needed to be. I think after that, there were some ruffled feathers that finally got smoothed out. But just so that you are aware, David, this is the first time that we've ever been on the target at the same time with each other. Gotcha. We always train together, but they do their thing over there. We do our thing over here. We just happen to do it in the same place at the same time, but we're not in the same building at the same time. And now, for the first time ever, we're fighting in the same building at the same time. And we have to figure out how to fight with one another. And just to be honest, man, that was a really, really painful learning process. Once we learned that, and Somalia is the thing that caused us to learn how to fight together, that bond became beautiful. Man, I saw this relationship in Iraq and Afghanistan that would have never been possible if it wasn't for Somalia. But man, it was really, really rough and a lot of ruffled feathers when we were figuring this thing out under fire in Somalia.
Did the Rangers back then, or you served with the Rangers, obviously, into Iraq and Afghanistan, as we talked about? Do the Rangers view the Delta guys kind of as like are they viewed as like, we want to be those guys? Because that's kind of the sense the movie gives, right? With the Josh Hartnett character, like they're a little bit enamored with him. They think they're role model. Is that how Rangers view guys that are in Delta?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, especially the newer Rangers. After a while, after you've had a chance to see how all the rest of the special operations forces work, you start to learn these guys are really, really good at this. These guys are really good at that. We're really good at this. And there's some overlap. But until you get to that point, and by the way, there's no question, these guys are better at this than anybody on the planet. So if you're going to admire somebody who can do this, there's nobody else to admire but these guys. And yeah, I mean, that was the case for me and everybody that I know. And I think it's right. It's deservedly so.
Awesome.
That unit, which I cannot name, is that good at what they do.
Yeah, no, maybe I shouldn't have dropped their name. I don't know. But yeah, no, everyone knows who we're talking about. But all right, last question. Now, this one comes from a fan, okay? I'm gonna read it to you how it was given to me. It's a fun one. Have some fun with it. It is the idea. It's a hypothetical. Okay, we need a straight answer. If you're in a helicopter, how many guys can fit on a Black Hawk?
The official answer, if you were to ask a Ranger sergeant, is you can always fit one more. It doesn't matter if there's 12 or 200. We can always fit one more. Jump in.
Okay, so let's say you got 12 guys. You're flying in a Black Hawk, and you go through a time hole to 1943, and you crash land in Germany. You're halfway between Hitler and the Eagle's Nest or safety in Switzerland. Are you and your 12 guys going to try to take out Hitler, or are you going to try to make it to Switzerland? What's your answer?
That is easy to answer. I'm going to Hitler, and I'm going to kill as many Nazis as I can along the way. Because my Ranger squad in 1944 in Nazi Germany is going to do a whole lot of killing before I get to the Eagle's Nest. And to be honest, they don't stand a chance when I get there.
That is a great answer. I actually was debating that with that person who sent me that question. I was like, I'm going to make this the fun one. I always pick one. That was great. But Jeff, I want to say thank you. Where can people find you? Like, what are your social media handles?
Man, I'm all over social media. You can find me at my website, jeffstruecker.com, or on all of the prominent social media platforms.
Perfect. So if you guys, hopefully the viewers enjoyed this. I enjoyed this. You can find more of Jeff online. I've seen his Instagram page. He's got a lot of good stuff, a lot of inspiring messages on there. So Jeff, I appreciate you coming in. This has been the first one we've done with OutKick, and what a guest to have to kick everything off.
Yeah, man. Thanks, David. It's been an honor to be with you.